Figure it out.
Hello, this is Adam Koralik with Figured Out Productions. The following video is a video of some kind, and I hope you enjoy it. Hey everyone, welcome to the Figure It Out cast. This is for December 2017. I'm Adam Koralik, and today we'll be talking about a whole host of subjects. As always, you can check the description and see what those subjects are. You can even skip around to timecode to different subjects if one interests you and another doesn't, or that kind of thing. So of course, this is a Patreon podcast first and foremost. So if you are a supporter of my Patreon, you got early access to this the day it was finished. And if you're not a Patreon backer, I still want you to be able to listen to it. So I release it on the channel at the end of the month. If you are a Patreon backer, you can also get early access to not just this, but regular videos I do. You usually get a few days early access and all that stuff, as well as other benefits. You can go over to my Patreon. There's a link in the description if you're interested. If not, just sit back and enjoy the show. So today we're going to be talking about a whole host of different things. First of all, I'm just kind of curious, I hope everyone out there, the Americans in particular, had a happy Thanksgiving, because obviously that really only applies to us. But in general, I hope everybody had a very nice November, and depending on when you've heard this, hopefully you had a very nice December as well, or going to have a nice December, happy holidays, all that fun stuff. So there's been a lot of craziness out there as far as media and entertainment, as there typically is. So I wanted to talk about some of the things. Now, of course, some of this is news at the time I record it, and some of this is just kind of like what my opinion of that particular thing was a while ago, because that's the nature of news. It doesn't stay news for very long. It becomes history very quickly. But I want to talk about, I guess the first things first isn't really news. It's just kind of stuff I've been up to. I wanted to talk about some video games, stuff I've been playing lately. This is I don't usually talk too much about that in general, but I thought in this time I would talk about a couple of different games in particular. So one game I played not too long ago that I had to record footage of for a video on Machinima was Sonic Forces. Now, I'm a big Sonic fan. I have been really since I was a kid, much like a lot of us. Sonic's time in the 3D realm hasn't been great, as I'm sure a lot of people know. They have managed to kind of recover him a bit over the past few years, but really, I think the pinnacle of Sonic 3D games was always Sonic Adventure 1 on the Sega Dreamcast, and then eventually GameCube, Xbox 360, which that game's actually backwards compatible on Xbox One now. You can play it there too, the digital version. Although the physical edition with the Dreamcast collection actually does work on the Xbox One, in case you're curious. But anyway, so that's still my favorite 3D Sonic game. So Sonic Forces certainly didn't beat that, but Sonic Forces was... it was one of the better ones from the 3D era. Sonic Adventure 1 still my favorite. Sonic Adventure 2 is probably right there after it. Things like Sonic's Lost World were pretty decent, a little comical, and probably like a good patch away from being great. Sonic Generations was pretty good. I'd put Sonic Forces in that kind of area as far as 3D Sonic games, although no dispute, Sonic Mania was the Sonic game this year, and it's still a shame that at least at the time I record this, there has yet to be a physical edition announced of that particular game, though we got every other piece of physical content for it, including a vinyl record, which I now own thanks to Corey Marshall, we'll be talking a little bit more about later on in this video. But, I got like the physical edition manual that was exclusive to PAX West. There was that collector's edition that came out, which I would love to have, but there was no disc, or in the case of the Switch, like a cart, so I never bothered. My point is, it got so much physical stuff, but not the actual game, and I keep hoping that gets it, because Sonic Mania is fantastic. But that's not the point. Sonic Forces. So yeah, I ended up beating this entire game. This is a short game. There's a reason it's pretty cheap. And I would advise it, $15 to $20 purchase, because I don't think it's really worth it beyond that. Available on PS4, Xbox One, and Switch. I played it on the Switch. And it takes about 3 to 4 hours to beat. 3 if you're like good, 4 if you kind of suck. It took me more like 4 because there were certain mechanics of that game that I really, really hated. Like the rail system, I really feel like they could have taken a page out of Sonic Adventure 2's playbook. The rail system in Sonic Adventure 2 is much more functional in my opinion, or maybe it's just... I don't know, maybe it's something about playing it on the Switch. Maybe if I'd played it on the Xbox One or PS4, I would have done better, but I died a lot on those stupid sections. They drove me insane. But aside from that, I enjoyed the game quite a bit. But I also had to play the entire thing in Japanese for the purpose of footage, so I actually don't really know what the hell the story of that game was, but I don't really care. It seemed like a direct sequel to Sonic Lost World, which I'm pretty sure the same internal team made it, so that would make a lot of sense. Overall, I enjoyed the game. Certainly not Sonic's best. It was kind of neat that they let you create a character for once and kind of incorporate them into the Sonic universe. That's a new thing, I guess. I mean, there's probably been some other Sonic game that allowed you to create a character at some point, but I don't remember one of the main storyline games allowing you to do that. So that's kind of neat. But yeah, I would say check it out, but only if you're kind of a Sonic fan already, and if you can get it kind of cheap. I wouldn't go much beyond that. The next thing I played a lot of recently was Super Lucky's Tale. Now, I've talked about this in the past. Now, Super Lucky's Tale, when Microsoft first showed that off at E3, I think it was this year, actually, 2017. When they first showed that off, I got really disappointed because I thought, much like a lot of people did, based on the teaser trailer, that it was a new Conker's Bad Fur Day game. And I was like, oh my god, this is going to be amazing, it's awesome. And then, like, Super Lucky's Tale is really the antithesis of a Conker's Bad Fur Day game. Like, it is as kid-friendly as it gets, while still being a good and competent platformer. So that there was that inherent disappointment in just that it wasn't the dream game that a lot of us had wanted. But that's not really anybody's fault. I mean, they never told us they were working on that. It was just one of those initial disappointment things, because you're just looking at it like, this had to have been Conker at some point, right? Or is this just an amazing coincidence? But yeah, I don't know. Anyway, point is, I played that game. I beat I got all the way through like a third of it. And I mean, at least at the point I've recorded this, it's pretty good. It's basically an attempt at a Mario 3D game without Mario. And with that premise, it's enjoyable. Now, of course, it is a kid-friendly game, so you will have to slug some of the bullshit that little kids games do, but at the same time, it is ultimately a pretty fun platformer with a lot of replayability, in my opinion, because you have to, basically the goal is kind of like in games like Super Mario Odyssey or Super Mario 64, where there's one level, there's like a central hub, and then there's a bunch of mini levels inside, where you go in and you have to collect stars in the case of Super Mario 64, or moons in the case of Super Mario Odyssey. You're kind of doing that, where you have this one level, and then there's a hub, and then there's a level inside the hub. There's multiple levels, and each level has multiple, in this case, like Lucky Charms or Lucky's, tails, whatever the fuck. They look like 4-leaf clovers, and that's essentially what you're pursuing. I think each level has a maximum of 4 of them, and it plays more like Super Mario Odyssey than Super Mario 64, if you want to give it more of a contemporary feel. And I'm sure that was very intentional on Microsoft's part. They probably wanted to be able to pitch this as like, hey, Mike, you can't get Super Mario Odyssey on the Xbox One, but you can get this. It's very, very similar. I don't know at this point in time how it's actually performed, if people have really cared. I know the game got cheap pretty quick, so it probably didn't do all that well. I got it for $15 post Black Friday, which is impressive. So yeah, that said, for $15, that game's definitely worth it. If you like that type of gameplay, if you like Super Mario Odyssey but not quite as good, Super Lucky's Tale is a pretty good game in that regard, and I would check it out if you can. And then the last thing I've kind of been playing a bit recently, kind of as a cheat to include this, but I'm going to, Far Cry 5. Depending on when you've heard this, I've played more or less of it. Now, at the time I record this, the only bit of Far Cry 5 I've played the one demo that was out, that was at E3 and was various Ubisoft events and PAX Prime and all this other stuff, PAX West, sorry. I've played that same demo 7 times. I've actually done multiple videos of it on both Game Society, my other channel, as well as Machinima. And I fucking love it. Like, Far Cry games are some of my favorite things. And if you're like, well, if you played it back then, why are you including it now? Well, because I'm going to, or have been to, depending on when you heard this, an event for that game in San Francisco that will be a Far Cry 5 specific event. So at that point, I will have played a lot more of it, and probably by the time this podcast is public, there will actually be new videos out based on my experiences. Like, I will have put out more gameplay of it. So it's hard to talk about those particular parts because obviously I haven't played them yet, and even if I had, they would be strictly NDA. But the stuff I can talk about is all the demo stuff I've played, and it's fantastic. I absolutely love what I've got to play of it, and I'm very, very excited to be able to play a more updated build with more content and ultimately have a final release. So yeah, I'm really excited about that. I love the Far Cry games, particularly the later ones. My sin is that I've never played Far Cry 3. And I think it was a bunch of people that just hovered over the unsubscribe button, but just chill. Sorry, I'm going to. My girlfriend's constantly pushing me to do it. I agree, I should do that. But Far Cry 4, I loved. I beat the shit out of that twice, unlocked everything, except for the racing stuff. I couldn't really ever kick ass at that. But other than that, I did really well. And then Far Cry Primal, I got all the way through. So Far Cry 5, I want to play in its entirety. That is a game that might push me to pick up an Xbox One X just for that game. Even though obviously it'll be available on PS4 Pro and all that stuff. It depends on where my TV situation is at that point, but I'm kind of feeling like if there's a good deal on the Xbox One X at around the time Far Cry 5 comes out, ooh, that might do it. That might get me to finally pick one up. I'm kind of just waiting for a deal on the Xbox One X. This wasn't really part of this subject or even on my list at all, but Xbox One X, hey, credit where credit's due. It's selling pretty nicely. I remember on Black Friday last month in November, I went to a couple of different Best Buys, and I kept noting that I even sent out a tweet about it. Interesting to note that this Best Buy has, you know, a ton of PS4 Pros and is completely sold out of Xbox One X's. Of course, the way I'd wrote it made it sound like I was talking about the entirety of the corporation, which I was not. And unfortunately, a lot of people misinterpreted what I said. I even got like a weird kind of hate video sent at me about that. But then the guy apologized because I said I wasn't talking about the corporation. I'm talking about the building I'm standing in. So he apologized. But anyway, yeah, it was just kind of interesting to see that. But yeah, I guess Xbox One X is doing well. But that's not the point of the subject. Point was various video games. And that's just some of the stuff I've been playing lately. Now, granted, that was a little while ago. And I've probably updated this list since, depending on when you're listening to this. But I enjoyed those games, and since you can't actually buy Far Cry 5 at this point in time, if I had to tell you pick up Sonic Forces or Super Lucky's Tale, I'd actually tell you Super Lucky's Tale. I had more fun with that. But I guess that only would apply to Xbox One and potentially PC gamers as well. Pick up Super Lucky's Tale. That game was kind of fun. So the next subject here is video game related, but is also very strange. And I'm of two completely different mindsets on this subject. The subject is Super Mario Cereal. Now, this has now become publicly available later on in the month, I believe. If you're a Patreon backer and you're listening to this at the beginning, this cereal is about to come out. It hasn't quite done it. But I'm sure a lot of you guys know what I'm talking about. It's just a box of cereal that's based on Super Mario Odyssey, and is, of course, Mario themed. And the thing that made it very interesting as a collectible item is that the box is a functional amiibo. Now, I read about what it does. You can actually take the box and scan it over a Switch, and it has compatibility with Super Mario Odyssey. What it will do is very limited. It's basically just gives you extra coins in the game, or like hearts, which is just health. Like, it's not like a mandatory amiibo with like extra DLC or whatever. It's just kind of like a fun thing to do. When I first read about this, I was actually like, this is just disgusting. Like, we're at that point. Like, amiibos are already kind of physical DLC, and it's kind of irritating. But I was like, you're going to incorporate this into a cereal box? Like, that's just sick. Like, it's gross. And, like, are we really going down that road where we're going to make that acceptable? That you have to, like, buy all the food products related to a game in order to play the whole experience? Like, it kind of pissed me off. And then, of course, it was lightened by the fact that the game content was essentially irrelevant. I mean, extra health and coins are easy enough to get in the actual game. You don't really need to worry about that. Which, incidentally, Super Mario Odyssey is a fantastic game if you haven't played it, but I'm sure a lot of you have. So that was kind of my mindset before. But I was actually talking to a friend of mine, and he made a really good point that completely flipped my opinion on this subject, which means it was a good point, because for him to make one point and have it completely reverse a decision is good. He basically said that this really isn't any different than when cereal boxes would come with a little toy inside, like a little race car or whatever, literally a Cracker Jack prize. He was like, this is just the same thing. Like, it's just a toy that makes the cereal experience better so that the kid gets more out of it than he otherwise would. And I was like, you know what? All right, I buy that argument. That actually makes a lot of sense. Like, because it's non-essential to the game, it's just a way to enhance the cereal to a certain extent as a product. And it is essentially the toy. There's no toy in the box. The toy is the amiibo functionality. And that's just fun for kids. So I completely changed my opinion on that. I think that was a really good point. And I'm curious, did anybody go out and get one? I was kind of considering getting a box, but then I was like, I'm not really going to eat this, and I don't collect amiibos. This is just dumb, so I didn't bother. But yeah, I'm curious if anybody else got it and what they thought of it. But yeah, that's really all I kind of have to say on the Super Mario cereal stuff, because originally I had more of a rant, but like I said, the guy kind of changed my opinion, or he totally changed my opinion. So I'm just like, it's a good point. So moving on, here's the next subject. This comes to us from Kyle Vaughn. Now, he is a Patreon backer who gets to pick a whole hell of a lot of things that I get to do on the channel because he's been around for a while. And like, you know, any of you, if you want to, you can pick the subject that I put out any time on the podcast. All you got to do is go to the Patreon page and sign up accordingly. But yeah, in this case, ironically enough, he actually didn't want to pick any particular subject. He told me, you know, just go ahead and pick what you want, which is what he usually kind of does. In this case, though, I found one I want to talk about because I think it's fascinating, and it's the exact same kind of thing that I know Kyle would really like. So Kyle, again, thank you very much for being at the Patreon level to support this. Now, at the time I record this, you can't do anything about this piece of information, but it's fascinating. A guy in Spain released publicly a Sega Saturn prototype. And I will show pictures of it right here in the podcast if you're watching it on YouTube, of course. Now, this dude is selling this out of Spain, and he claims that this was a former Sega Saturn prototype, and you can read all about it on his eBay page. But it was just interesting to me that this surfaced. I don't think it's functional. I think it's just kind of, you know, it just looks like, you know, it was just something Sega was working on at one point. But I do find it fascinating that this thing ever existed. The dude was asking basically 6,000 euros, which is like 7,100 and, you know, like $50, something like that. It's around there. And he ended up selling it. Somebody bought this thing. So congratulations to that guy for making like a fuck ton of money. But the point is, I just think it's fascinating whenever one of these like prototypes shows up. Like, where was it all this time? Who was holding on to it? Why were they holding on to it? I mean, still the Holy Grail is what my buddy owns, the Nintendo PlayStation prototype, Terry Diebold, he owns the PlayStation Nintendo prototype. And that, of course, is the Holy Grail, because that wasn't by one company, that was by two, and is, you know, the legacy of two different companies. It's insane. But in this case, I mean, how many of us even knew Sega had this, that at some point they were working on a version of the Sega Saturn that looked like this? And that it still existed somewhere, and that someone had the opportunity to buy it. I find stuff like that fascinating, man. Like a couple of different podcasts, like a few podcasts ago, I talked about the same thing where a different Atari product had shown up. I think it was the Atari 2700 had shown up somewhere. Stuff like that is always fascinating to me, and I know Kyle really likes that as well. So, Kyle, thank you again for being a backer and supporting the podcast, and also having the same quirky interest as me in these kind of bizarre pieces of hardware that just show up. And you know, I mean, looking at it right now, I'm looking at it, and I'll keep photos of it up. It's such a strange design. It clearly is early on, because I mean, it's also not the best of shape, but I mean, it's kind of ugly, and it looks a lot like a CD player, which is probably why Sega didn't ultimately go with it. It looks more like a music device than a game console. But I mean, you know, who knows? Maybe with a right number of, you know, alterations, it would have been flawless. I don't know. And the cartridge slot looks especially kind of screwed up. But again, I'm going to chalk that up to prototype. You know, maybe this was early on. This was one of the ones that would have played, because there was a phase there where the Saturn was going to play Sega Genesis or Mega Drive games. It's possible this is the shell of that, of one of those that was made that possible. Because that was going to be a thing for a little bit, and obviously it ultimately should have been, but that's a whole different discussion in of itself. But yeah, I mean, that's really all I have to say on this thing. I think it's just fascinating that this existed, and whoever the owner is, take good care of it, man. Preserve that history, and you know, to the guy who did have it, I'm glad you held on to it, even though you obviously, you know, made a tidy little sum from doing so. I'm glad that this thing didn't get destroyed and disregarded into history. So that's pretty cool. Thank you, Kyle. Now, moving on. This is old news to a lot of you, but I wanted to talk about it for more of my own reasons. EA's stock plummeted $3 billion in value after the debacle that was the Star Wars Battlefront 2 release. As I'm sure a lot of you guys know, you know, they did a whole lot with microtransactions and loot boxes and all this other stuff that really pissed off a lot of people, and you know, it basically destroyed the game in a lot of ways. And that's not really what I'm here to talk about, but what I am here to talk about is more so the, you know, I told you kind of thing. I have mentioned for a long time, if you're new to me, relatively new to me, for years, my number one most anticipated game that was a fantasy was Shenmue 3. Now, obviously, we are getting that. But right after Shenmue 3, the one that people don't really know I always wanted was Star Wars Battlefront 3. The Star Wars Battlefront games on the OG Xbox are some of my favorite games of all time, and I've wanted a third, like, real one for forever. Really since 2005 when Star Wars Battlefront 2 came out. And at one point, it was in development. I think it got nearly finished before LucasArts ultimately shut their door. I know there is some sort of Xbox 360 build of the ill-fated Star Wars Battlefront 3 that did exist or does exist somewhere. But ultimately, obviously, as a lot of you know, Disney bought Star Wars. They bought Lucasfilm, and LucasArts went with that. Now, Disney shut down LucasArts, and what they decided to do was, because they weren't doing internal game development anymore, there was a time where Disney was a developer. Disney decided they would basically hand the Star Wars license in games to a big developer. And when it comes to developers that are big enough, there's really only a few choices. They obviously picked EA, which was the worst possible choice you could have made. And I remember the time actually mourning that. I was like, they're going to make crap. They're going to make shit games that we're going to hate. And I'm yet to be proven wrong. When Star Wars Battlefront 1 came out, regardless if you actually enjoyed the gameplay of the online component of it, it was still a game without a single-player campaign, which was a huge part of what made the Battlefront games good. And ultimately, the game is now a coaster because the online community for it isn't very there. So it doesn't really have much functionality anymore. I mean, sure, you could still find a match at the point in time that I'm recording this, but it's much harder now. And as it dwindles more and more, eventually that game is totally unplayable. And I was not surprised, so I never picked it up because I don't pick up online-only games. I just don't do it. And then, obviously, Star Wars Battlefront 2 came out, and I said that I was cautiously optimistic, but at the same time, it's EA. They're going to do something that's going to be awful. And they did, as we alluded to earlier. The reason I was cautiously optimistic is because they kept saying, hey, we're going to focus more on single player and all this stuff. And to an extent, they did do that. But at the same time, they fucked it up to the point where it's been boycotted, and it cost them serious repercussions. And the only other thing they were working on was the game by Visceral Games, which I think was in development for 4 years. But as EA, as we famously know now, shut down Visceral Games, so that game went with it. So in, I think, the now 5 years that EA has had the access to the Star Wars license, well, all right, we'll give them a little leeway. It was more like 4.5 years, but still. In the time that they've had access to the Star Wars license, they've only made 2 games. Battlefront 1 and 2, and each one has tons of drama surrounding them, particularly the second one. And I don't know what happens throughout the course of December, because I'm still very early on in it, so it's possible this actually did happen, but I would doubt it. I've been reading a lot that a lot of people think Disney might pull the plug on Star Wars from EA, because it was ultimately Disney that made that call that said, EA, change what you're doing. We don't like the way you're handling the situation. Because ultimately what they did really hurt the Star Wars brand in general, and Disney's about to release, or at least the time I record this, is about to release The Last Jedi, and they really don't want a whole lot of bad press. So I kind of want to talk not so much about EA's stock plummeting, even though that's just really the devil getting its due, but I want to talk a little bit about who I think should take over Star Wars in games. Now, I have to say this with a couple of caveats here. One, as much as we'd all love to see the games be made by like our favorite indie developer or whatever, the reality is Disney would never allow that possibility. You're not going to trust a major franchise, possibly the biggest franchise in entertainment history, to an indie. You're just not going to. They're not going to have the budget and resources to pull off the mass marketing media like piece of entertainment that you would have to create. So that really only leaves you with a few different possibilities, which is one of the reasons they picked EA in the first place. So you can't say you want some indie development team to make that game. I'm sorry, you just can't. You can fantasize about it, but you can't expect that to be real. The other thing is, I think we have to also eliminate any company that is not American. My guess is Disney would not want to hand it to a Japanese developer. Maybe for like an individual game they would do that. They'd hand it to like Ubisoft, who's French. They might do that for like one game, but like the entity, the entire concept of Star Wars being handed over to some other developer, I just can't see Disney doing that with a foreign entity. That's kind of my guess. So then you think, all right, well, who are your options? Activision is a choice. I don't know if they would pick Activision. Activision seems kind of probable, but not necessarily the ones they would ultimately go with. And then you got 2K, although 2K is a little weird because their parent company is Take-Two, and I think Take-Two is technically British, though I'm not 100% sure about that. And then you've got Bethesda. Bethesda might be a good choice. You got a few of them, but there's not a whole lot that have that level of resources. Like, think about the ones who have their own shows at E3. And I don't mean like a booth. I mean like they have their own major press conference along with Nintendo, Microsoft, and Sony. That's pretty much just like Bethesda, Ubisoft, Activision, and EA. So I actually think that the franchise might be best served in Bethesda's hands as opposed to anyone else's. And that would be who I think I would want it to go into the hands of. I just don't think it will. I think it'll probably stay with EA for the time being. I think Disney would be very likely to put it, if they had to switch hands, they'd probably throw it at Activision, would be my guess. But my choice, given all those restrictions I listed, would probably be Bethesda. But, what do you guys think? Who would you pick? And again, you can throw out your fantasy indie developer, you can throw out your fantasy Japanese or European company, you can do that. But you have to understand those are way less likely for reasons previously stated. So if you're thinking, essentially you got to think big budget company, American. Like those are your two kind of qualifying criteria, because I'm betting that's Disney's qualifying criteria, and they ultimately get the call on that. So with that caveat in mind, who would you pick? I'm curious. But anyway, so I think that's it for that particular subject. So moving on, I want to do a couple of shout outs here. So now everyone here who's about to be mentioned is also Patreon backers. They've helped make not only this podcast possible, but the channel in general, because as I'm sure a lot of you know, Adpocalypse is killing off YouTubers. I'm just going to keep it real with you. We're not doing well. So I want to thank you guys for being backers. I want to thank everybody who supports this, even if you're not at the level in which you get a shout out, which you could upgrade to at any time of your choosing. If you're just a backer, or even if you're just listening to this video, which I still appreciate a lot. I want to give these people shout outs in particular. So I got 4 names here. I'm going to list them off and then basically just make up some stuff about them. So we have Justin Webb. We have Rob Janos. We have Trey Wagner. And we have Tim Inman. Now, the thing is, I'm going to make up something that they all like based on their last name. Okay, that's what I'm going to do. Now, Justin Webb, it's pretty obvious he likes spiders. Like, it's actually kind of messed up. I've hung out with Justin before, and it's like he would not stop talking about how great spiders were. He would play with them on his arms. It was kind of messed up, but, it's like, hey, he's a nice guy. If he wants to play with spiders, he can have at it. So thank you, Justin, for your spider fetish. I'm not judging. Just saying. You play with spiders. You have fun. Rob Janos. He is Brazilian. He was trying to change his name to Rio. It's Rio de Janeiro. He was trying to change it to that, but he couldn't quite spell it. So Rob Janos is what they wrote out. It's an accent thing. It happens. But Rob Janos, you're still a cool dude. Again, we hung out too, and I didn't judge you for misspelling Rio de Janeiro as your name. I mean, now that I realize it, Rob is probably meant to be Rio. Wow, that's mind blowing. You're gonna be Rio Janeiro, which means you forgot the D. What's your middle name? Is it something like, does it start with a D? I bet it starts with a D. Holy crap, mind blown. Thank you, Rob. Trey Wagner. His last name is based on the fact that he really likes to watch dogs wag their tails. I also hang out with Trey, and this is true. I actually hang out with Trey on a regular basis. He's an awesome guy, but he never stops looking at dogs. Like, we'll walk on, we'll see a dog, and he'll just be like, I gotta wait, just hang on a second, dude. And then when the dog wags his tail, he's like, fuck yeah! And then I was like, all right, you good? And he's like, oh, I'm good. And we walk down the street and we move on. I just have to keep dealing with it. It takes us like 20 minutes to walk down the street if we ever see a dog, because it just keeps coming up. It's fucked up. But thank you, Trey, nevertheless. And finally, Tim Inman. Now, I've never hung out with Tim, but I get the sense that he likes Entenmann's Donuts, just based on his name, Tim Inman, Tim Entenmann's. I'm just saying. Entenmann, and they're not even like that good at donuts, man. That's the weirdest part. Like, there are so many better donuts than Entenmann's Donuts. why are you eating those Entenmann's donuts? You can get so many other choices. But still, I thank you for your patronage. I thank all of you for your patronage, even if you like Entenmann's donuts too much. But still, it's awesome. Anyway, guys, thank you for being good sports as well. Thank you for supporting the Patreon podcast. Thank you all for listening. And now let's continue onward. We have a new backer who also is at the level in which he gets to pick a subject. Is Joshua Finzi. His name might sound familiar. He has shown up on live shows before and usually donated there. So it was very cool of him to show up on Patreon as well. And in this case, he got to pick a subject for this particular podcast. Now, the subject he picked, which I of course talk about because that's what he picked, I have to admit, I'm probably not the best person to be talking about this, but we'll talk about it. What he specifically wanted was for me to discuss the Switch's online features I wanted to see because it's going to be fully active later on in 2018. Now, okay, a lot of you guys, I'm sure, know I'm not really a big online gamer, as I just alluded to with Battlefront 1 there. Like, I don't care about online gameplay, so I'm really not the best person to be looking at for specific features. When I used to play online more, the features I would want were usually the ease of getting into a lobby, ease of finding a match, ease of communication with other people. Obviously, things like I don't want to have to suffer through lag, and I also want to have some sort of additional content that I can enjoy online that I otherwise couldn't in the single player campaign. But generally, I don't. But I certainly don't want to see is like story elements that are, mandatory by playing online. Things like Titanfall, like doing that. I don't want to see stuff like that. Now, I'm sure that's not really the focus of his question. He wants to focus more on what the Switch should do specifically. So all I know, I've played the Switch online a couple of times, and I didn't particularly enjoy or did not enjoy the experience. I played Mario Kart 8 a couple of times. I noticed that like 1 out of every 3 times it was unable to connect or unable to, find a match. Now, I chalk that up to the fact that it was still early on in their free service and, whatever. But I guess what I would want to see is just more reliability in that. But beyond that, I don't know. I mean, I know they need to improve their communication system because they have like a whole series of like apps and stuff you have to use in conjunction with your phone in order to communicate online. I'd love to see Nintendo drop that. I don't think they will. And beyond that, I don't really know if I have anything because I haven't played it online enough. So it would be cool. All right, hear me out on this. This is complete fantasy. I'm pulling this out of my ass. But what I think it would be really cool is if they created some sort of link cable for the Switch. I don't even know if this is possible, but if they created some sort of link cable from the Switch that basically is like a USB-C cable that plugs from the Switch into the dock, which would allow you to still use the TV for the Switch, but at the same time use it as a controller with the screen. It would be nice if there were kind of like the Wii U attempted to, where you're essentially doing dual screens. But in this particular case, I would love to see one where it was, when it was using online modes, where it essentially have a chat system like on the screen in front of you, and then on the TV you were playing the game. Or you could, potentially reverse that. Again, I don't know if that's possible, but I'd love to see if they're fucking dedicated to not having an audio chat system, I'd love to see a text chat system there, or some other online integration in there, something you can only do online in that type of setup, in that type of environment. I think that would be neat. Maybe some sort of achievement tracker or something like that. I don't know. It depends on the game. It depends on the infrastructure. There's so many variables to that. But I guess ultimately what I would really want to see is just stable online gameplay and quality titles to back them up. But again, I'm not the greatest test audience for that kind of thing because I don't really play online much in general. I'm more interested in like what you can do. And that's why my idea would be to use something like a weird cable that could allow you to have extra features you didn't know could originally exist. So that's it. Thank you, Joshua, for that particular subject. Thank you for being a Patreon backer. Next piece of news here. Very limited little discussion here. It's just kind of interesting. MegaMan 11 was announced, as I'm sure all of you know at this point. Now, the reason I want to discuss this isn't like that I'm some big MegaMan fan and I've never talked about it. To be honest, I'm not. I haven't played much of that series. It was more to me that it was interesting that they actually are going ahead and doing it, because Mega Man 11's non-existence is really the reason Mighty Number 9 ever got made in the first place, which is the spiritual sequel that was made because Capcom wouldn't play ball. Now, Mighty Number 9 was obviously a colossal disaster in the end. I mean, even though it did well, it wasn't actually a very good game. But it's interesting to see that Capcom has really come full circle, because to those who don't know, the way I can describe Capcom, back in the day, like the 80s and the 90s, you saw a Capcom logo on something, oh, that's just a good game. That's just going to be a good game. Like, that's a guarantee. Their name's on it. Capcom means good game. It was like Sega, Nintendo, Capcom, Konami. Like, if you saw those logos, the game was automatically good. There were very few times where any of those four companies didn't make a good game. Now, obviously, with the exception of Nintendo, they've all pretty much dropped off in that regard. I mean, Konami is now considered like the devil of Japanese game developers. Sega is mostly irrelevant. As much as I love them, they don't really make many games at all, and the ones they do, with the exception of Yakuza, are generally not that great. And a lot of the stuff that they make, they don't even internally develop. They let other parties develop them. I think the only thing they internally develop, at least for the West, is still Yakuza, which is a good game, though. They're just a different entity now. That's a whole different discussion. But Capcom, after that, became like a fucking cell phone company. And what I mean by that is they were just making games for the mobile market. They were making junk to try and get a quick buck, and it devastated them, man. Like, their value as a corporation completely fell to the point where they were almost up for sale. Like, it was almost like they were gonna have to file, I don't know, was it Chapter 11 or Chapter 7? I can't remember. The one where they wouldn't have to liquidate their assets. No, the one where they would. That would be Chapter 7, where they have to liquidate their assets, and ultimately that's like what happened with THQ, for example. I believe it was Chapter 7 again that they filed, which dissolved all their assets, and that's how, you know, the WWE franchise went from 2K over to went from THQ to 2K, and how South Park went from THQ to Ubisoft, and so on. I kind of thought the same thing was going to happen with Capcom. That their assets were going to be dissolved mostly into other Japanese companies. I thought Sega and Nintendo would probably be big bidders in that. But ultimately, Capcom they were very fiscally responsible. They didn't want to go under, and they made a lot of smart choices. I think they're pretty, I don't know if they're like a Fortune 500 company at this point, but they're definitely in a much better place. And I'm sure they basically recognized the market when they put out the MegaMan collections and the Mega Man X collections and all that stuff. And they realized, like, okay, I get it. You guys don't want us to make these stupid mobile games. You want us to make stuff that you want. No shit. So they decided to go ahead and finally make Mega Man 11. And I'm guessing it's going to sell really well for them. So I congratulate them on finally doing the right thing and finally getting their house in order. That's good, because as neat as it would have been to see some of their assets, their IPs in, you know, the house of Nintendo, the house of Sega or whatever, it was unlikely I shouldn't say that. It was likely to happen. It would have been kind of bad to have another monopoly, because they have such great IPs, and it would have been cool to see them shared. But at the same time, it's kind of nice that, you know, that their IPs can show up on multiple platforms and be more involved in other parties. I don't know. It's just, I kind of like competition. I kind of think that that's kind of helpful. But yeah, I'm glad to not see them go. I'm glad that they've kind of gotten themselves together, and hopefully Mega Man 11 actually turns out well. I don't know. You'll have to forgive me on the name, I'm spacing out, but the guy who originally was making Mega Man and then ultimately went off to make Mighty Number 9, like the creator of it, I don't know at this point in time if he has anything to do with Mega Man 11. I hope he does, but, you know, I don't know. And I'm just glad Capcom's kind of coming around. So that's actually the last subject I want to talk about as far as video games stuff go. So the rest of these three subjects are going to be about movies. So if you're not really a movie person, thank you for watching, and I guess we'll talk later. But if you are, I saw a few movies lately, and I wanted to talk about them. The first one up that I saw was The Disaster Artist. Now, The Disaster Artist is the James Franco movie about the creation of Tommy Wiseau's The Room. Now, I'm a huge fan of The Room. That's, to me, one of the greatest pieces of film ever created, because it's so infamously awful. Like, it is, if you've never seen it, it is really a funny, amazing film because of how bad it is, often described as the Citizen Kane of bad movies. It truly is. I mean, it is such an experience on so many levels, and I never recommend anybody watch it by themselves for the first time. It really works best with a group, so that you guys can all kind of go through the madness together. And there's so much rewatchability to that film. Things like, if you have the Blu-ray of this, I highly recommend doing this. Turn on the subtitles. Like, even if you can understand the actors just fine and you don't need it to read, turn on the subtitles. The subtitles have dialogue from scenes off screen that you didn't even know was happening, and it's fucking weird. It's really weird. If you ever see it with an audience, which I've done as well, that's an experience too, because it has audience participation. People interact with it. You know, when they see stuff on the screen, like there's framed photos of spoons for some reason in the background in that movie. So whenever they show up on screen, people yell spoons and they throw plastic spoons in the audience. Tommy Wiseau actually goes to a lot of the screenings, and he'll toss a football around with people, sign autographs. I've met him twice. I've got autographs of stuff he signed. Greg Sestero, who played Mark, he does the same thing. The two of them really embraced what that movie became, whereas I don't think any of the other actors really did that were in it. But yeah, so this movie, The Disaster Artist, is basically the documentary, not the documentary, the film about the making of that film that James Franco not only starred in, but he actually directed. And he does an amazing job. I mean, James Franco has never been one of my favorite actors, and he's in a lot of terrible movies. But in that case, like, he's really good. Like, he becomes Tommy Wiseau. It's actually a very impressive performance. So if you don't want to hear any spoilers or anything, I would just stop listening, because I'm pretty much going to talk about that now. Well, I won't say spoilers necessarily, but I will talk about it in depth. My biggest beef with that movie was the casting of the other actors to play the other characters, because they do have characters from The Room who are played by different actors, of course, essentially actors playing actors, if that makes sense. And James Franco does it perfectly, but everyone else, particularly his brother who played Greg Sestero, aka Mark, I never bought him as Greg Sestero. And he obviously got the role because he's James Franco's brother. But I don't know. I did not like his particular casting. He didn't look like Greg Sestero. He didn't really capture that too well. The other actors I kind of give a pass to because they're only, in bit parts. But yeah, that was my biggest issue. Like, he does a fine performance as an actor, but he doesn't perform as Greg Sestero, if that makes any sense at all. But next to James Franco, it's like, what were you going to do? The dude did it like flawlessly. I mean, I've heard that James Franco really wanted that movie to feel like The Room to an extent. So he actually stayed in character while directing the film, so that it would have that extra level of like Tommy Wiseau madness to it. And I will also say this: if you see the movie, stick around. There is an end credits scene, and it's definitely worth sticking around for. I got to see it early because in most of the country it came out on December 8th, which happens to be my birthday, which I always thought, oh, that's going to be a great birthday gift for myself. But in Chicago and a few other cities, I think it was only 19 theaters across all of the U.S. It came out like a week and a half early, so I actually got to see it on November 30th. I was really excited. I went and I did it. And then a few days later on December 4th, I actually went and saw it again, which is really rare for me. I really very rarely go to see a movie in theaters twice. It's really very, very uncommon. So I really enjoyed that, and I highly recommend it to anyone who is a fan of The Room or has seen The Room. But if you have not seen The Room, there's probably no reason to see The Disaster Artist. I mean, I guess I can't say for sure how well it would function as its own movie. Then it would just come off like a weird guy and his buddy, like, trying to make a weird movie that you don't really see much of. In order to really appreciate it, you have to have seen The Room. That's the big qualifier for it. So I highly recommend you do that. And then once you've done that, see The Disaster Artist. The Room is a fascinating film because there's always this... I feel like that movie really starts about 20 minutes in. I feel like most bad movies that are comedic in nature because of how bad they are, take about 20 minutes to really get started, because that first 20 minutes is you questioning the reality you're sitting through before they do something that really breaks it and you just kind of embrace what's going on. That's the biggest flaw with The Room, is that when you try to show it to somebody, it's kind of hard to get them into it in the first couple of scenes because of how awkward it is. And you know what I'm talking about if you've seen it. It's awkward for a lot of people, and a lot of people don't sit beyond that a couple of initial scenes. But you got to power through those to get basically the 20-minute mark, and then the movie just kind of goes nuts. But yeah, there you go. That's my opinion on The Disaster Artist. That movie works all the way through, but again, you got to see The Room first. Next up, I saw the movie Coco, which is the Disney Pixar film about Dia de Muerto, the Day of the Dead, big Mexican holiday. It's Disney Pixar. Now, here's the thing about Pixar. I have seen every single Disney Pixar movie in theaters since Toy Story, the first one, 95. Now, I mean Pixar specifically, not like, I'm not using that term generically to mean every CGI movie for kids. I mean the actual ones done in-house by Pixar Animation, which I don't know how many there are offhand, but I have seen them all, like the Toy Story trilogy, Bug's Life, all the Cars trilogy, which was the second one in particular was very tough, Brave, Wall-E, you know what I'm talking about, like those. And I didn't want to break with that tradition. Coco was good, but it was incredibly standard as for the plot, like the architect of what actually the archetype of the protagonist, like essentially it's, hey, I'm a child protagonist and I want to do a thing, but there's things stopping me from doing that thing, but I'm going to defy them and go on this big journey, and once I get to the thing I realize it's not as great as I thought it was, but there's still room for that thing as I've learned a lesson about it and I've taught other people a lesson along the way, and at the end everybody's happy. Like that general child arc is in this. It's just kind of danced up, with other bits and unique animation. I think if you're really into animation, that's a great movie to check out because of all the stuff they did. I've never seen another Pixar movie that opened with a little mini doc, and I mean a mini doc, like it's literally like like a flat shot of three people talking about what they did to make the movie, and then a couple clips of that in particular. I've never seen another Disney Pixar movie that opened with a scene like that where they just told you how hard the movie was to make. So golf clap. Thank you. I'm glad you did a good job. They also showed the little Frozen mini sequel in there, like Olaf's Christmas Adventure, which I've read online. People absolutely hate that. I can't say I hated it. I didn't enjoy it particularly. I think the offensive, if you want to call it that, part about it to me was that one of the best things about Pixar movies is they always open with a short by Pixar. This one was not by Pixar. It was a Frozen sequel, which was a different team. So it was a little weird to have that in there, but I'm assuming Disney had their reasons. Frozen, one of the biggest movies ever. I'm sure they want to kind of keep that brand alive. But that short in particular was very unexceptional. I don't know. So that kind of left a bad flavor, but then you go into Coco and you forget all about it. So after I wrapped up the podcast, I was reading a little bit and I felt I had to interject here and include this, even though this is a video game sort of podcast. I was reading about the Olaf's Frozen Adventure thing that we were just talking about, and it turns out that the reception to it has been so bad, Disney has decided to pull it from screenings of Coco. Effective December 8th, my birthday, they will be pulling, you'll no longer be able to see, when you go to see Coco, it will no longer be showing it. They're claiming, that was always the plan, but yeah, a lot of people think it's just the reception to it was so negative that I didn't realize the reception was as negative as it apparently was. And a large part of it is due to the length. I didn't even think about it when I was in theaters, but apparently it's like a 21-minute short. And I remember feeling that it felt long, but I didn't realize it was actually 21 minutes. I mean, that is actually pretty long for something that's supposed to... I mean, the reality is mostly it's kids going to this stuff, and you got to try and keep them entertained. And that movie really doesn't do it. It's funny reading some of the reviews of it because people were saying things like, what drove me nuts about it was, there were so many songs and they were all so terrible and they never really made a point. And I remember thinking like, that was my reaction watching it, was like, when they played a song, I was like, you just did one. Just stop it. They're not even good songs. It was apparent. I don't know if it deserves all the hate it's getting, but I don't blame Disney for pulling it because there's a lot of people like actively not seeing Coco because of it, apparently. I will say this though, in hindsight, during that initial, beforehand, there was this only one person with a little kid in the screening, and the kid was like screaming constantly. Kind of calmed down once Frozen started, and like halfway through Frozen just started like losing their shit. And then they left as Coco itself was in its opening credits, and then they never came back. So I guess I'm kind of thankful in that sense to the Frozen short, because it kept a little kid who was screaming out of the theater so I could enjoy the movie. So whatever. So if you like Disney Pixar type of movies, Coco's pretty cool, especially if you like, you know, music and stuff like that, which not a whole lot of that works for me, but I still enjoyed the film. So there you go. And the last subject we're going to talk about here comes to us from Corey Marsh, who I said yes we would talk about towards the end. Corey Marsh has been a Patreon backer for a long time. Every month he gets to pick a subject, and this time around, it's funny, I was talking to him like about what he wanted to pick, and he had picked a subject about the Xbox One X, which I had actually just talked about in my recap video. So I was like, I could, but it'd be the same subject again. He's like, oh, don't do that. Then he's like, how about we talk about vinyl records and their video game soundtrack revival? I'm like, this sounds really familiar. And then I realized Kyle Vaughn had picked that exact same subject last month. And I was like, that's why you liked it, because you heard me talk about it. He's like, fuck, did I? All right. So like, yeah, it was funny. And then finally it came around to this. He was like, did you see Justice League? I was like, yeah. He's like, talk about Justice League. I'm like, all right. So here we are. We're going to talk about Justice League. Now, Justice League, I got a bit to say. I can talk about just the movie itself, but I kind of want to talk about how we got to where it was. But the first thing I'll say about Justice League is, well, this movie lost a ton of money, and I would say see it for like $5. It's not worth any major investment because it's not a great film. It's exactly a product of what it was, which is a production that had a bad foundation, had to fix itself on the fly, and then compressed itself from 2 movies into 1, and then basically took 1 movie and compressed it into half a movie, and then said, okay, there's our movie. It's got 2 different directors on it. It's essentially a mess. It's a watchable mess with a very much like, I mean, I hate to compare it to this, but like Coco had a very, like I described, its archetype character, you know, its protagonist having a very standard adventure story. Justice League has a very standard story of like, hey, we're a bunch of characters, we're going to get together. All right, we got together. We got to fight the big bad guy who wants revenge for some reason or whatever. Okay, we did it. Yay. Like, it's got that kind of storyline. And while I recognize that I am a huge Superman fan, so that gives me a kind of a bias, I will say Superman's the best part of that movie. He really is. And I wish that Superman, the one minus CGI beard face, had been the Superman we were getting for the past couple of movies. So here's where we dig in a little bit. For those who don't know, the part of the reason Justice League is all screwed up is because the DCU, which is unofficially titled that, was Warner Brothers' attempt to basically do what Marvel's doing, which is create a cinematic universe and then just kind of have this ongoing universe of films that are all tied together that bring people into the theater. It's essentially like you're getting one episode of the biggest TV show of the year, like once or twice a year. That's the model that Marvel kind of eventually got into. That's not what they set out to do. Every other cinematic universe out there essentially failed to create a cinematic universe because they tried to make one on purpose, where Marvel just kind of like said, hey, let's make a good movie and we'll leave a couple like sprinkles of ties to other things in there and we'll just hope for the best. That's what they did, and they eventually made it work. Where every other company who has done all these cinematic universes, like The Mummy with Tom Cruise was a horrible failure. The Spider-Man universe that Sony attempted to do failed miserably. The Ghostbusters universe that Sony attempted to do failed miserably. Now Warner Brothers, of course, has failed miserably, although they at least held into it there for a little bit with the DCU. The problem is that they didn't have an architect for their universe. Marvel did. They had Kevin Feige. In the case of Warner Brothers, they're known as the most filmmaker-friendly studio of all of them, which is a good thing. It means that they like to trust the filmmaker and they don't try to interfere with their work, which is usually good. But the problem is you left that universe to be created by Zack Snyder. Zack Snyder is not a very good filmmaker. He's a brilliant visual artist, and you know, he can tell kind of cool stories, but he he's an Elseworlds storyteller. You know what I mean? Like, his Superman is not Superman. And they should not have built a foundation off of Man of Steel. Even though I enjoyed Man of Steel, it was a strange place to start because that was like a weirder, darker Superman, more gritty, realistic Superman. And that's not really what Superman is about. But set that aside, I would have said, okay, Man of Steel is decent enough to start from. Why don't we then move on with someone else? But they didn't. What broke that franchise was Batman versus Superman, or Batman v Superman, whatever the fuck, Dawn of Justice. That movie is unwatchable, essentially. The extended cut is better, which is another thing about Justice League. There's some rule out there about movies. If it's under 2 hours, then they can play it more times. And if they play it more times, they make more money on it. So a lot of movies like Justice League or Batman v Superman, which clearly need to be longer, get chopped down to that length so that they can make more money on it. The problem with that, of course, is you make a more incompetent movie. And it really, really hurt with Batman v Superman. That movie still isn't that good, even in the extended cut. It's just better. But yeah, anyway, so I did an entire podcast, not a podcast, like a live show. It was like 3 hours of just breaking down what I hated about Batman v Superman. So I'm not going to go into all that here. But suffice it to say, the biggest problem with that movie is that it tried to jump the gun way too early. And it did way too much damage to its core characters. There was no way to build a real foundation off of it. You had an evil, essentially evil Superman, and then you wasted the death of Superman storyline. You wasted all these other storylines. You got all these characters together way too quickly. And you had there's one thing about Batman v Superman that's actually brilliant, and it's how I would have, if I was in charge, how I would have designed the DCU, which is the opening scene of Batman v Superman is basically Batman, Bruce Wayne, wandering around the streets of, I guess it's Gotham or Metropolis in that case, filmed in Chicago, here in Chicago, actually. And what he's seeing is the Zod Superman fight from his perspective. So in the actual Man of Steel movie, they're fighting and they're causing all this damage, but you're not really focusing on the ground level. Batman is the ground level, and he's kind of trying to deal with the damage of all that shit. And then I would have loved it. And then after that, all right, so after that, they show that scene. They then say, all right, like 18 months later or whatever, they fast forward. I would have loved it if every single DCU movie had started like that, which is, imagine an Aquaman movie that starts, because if you remember in Man of Steel, there's the world engine thing. It's trying to destroy the ocean. It's in the Indian Ocean at one point. So I have to assume it caused a whole fuck ton of damage to Atlantis. So I wanted to see a movie that starts off with Aquaman having to deal with that, with the damage that's being caused to Atlantis. And you basically take all those characters and just show what the hell was happening when the Superman event showed up, because Superman would be the most iconic event in human history at that point. And it actually even fits with the tones, because in Justice League, they basically talk about how he was the central focus. I mean, like, the entire reason Steppenwolf shows up is because Superman is dead. Spoilers. In a weird, like, oh, there's no hope anymore kind of stupid tone. But you could have done that competently. They were too excited and they jumped to the gun and made essentially the equivalent of what Marvel did with Captain America Civil War. They tried to do that in their second movie instead of like their 19th or whatever the fuck Marvel did. Like, we didn't have time to get there. So that's how I would have set up the DCU, is tie all the characters together by using Man of Steel as your core. Even though Man of Steel was just an okay launching pad, but it would have been good enough. Batman v Superman broke that universe. So here's where we get into Justice League. When they started production on Justice League, they had only known about the response to Batman v Superman for a couple of weeks. I mean, they had gone into production around then. So there, a lot of people say, well, why didn't they just cancel it? Why didn't they delay it? Because you're talking about spending millions had already been spent at that point to get that production into place, and to cancel it or whatever would have been even more costly. So they gambled. And the gamble was, we'll just kind of fix it on the fly. We'll try and make something out of this, and hopefully it just kind of turns out, because the alternative was to delay it and lose their money, but cut their losses. Ultimately, it seems like what they should have done was delay, because the amount of money they're ultimately going to have lost on Justice League is insane. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I know Justice League needed about $1 billion to essentially break even. At this point in time, it's grossed about 580 worldwide. So it's going to be a huge loss. To explain in quick terms here, to explain how budgets work, when you look at Box Office Mojo and you see, oh, this movie cost $100 million and made $300 million, how is that movie a flop? You're an idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. Unsubbed. Hang on. There's a lot more you're not getting. A movie's production budget, let's say it's listed there on Box Office Mojo and says it's $100 million. Okay, fine. You have to actually double that right away because they spend typically the budget of the film, they double it so that they can also advertise it. Your production budget does not include like commercials you see on TV or, you know, ads you see all over the internet or whatever. They basically always double it. So then you're thinking, okay, it cost them about $200 million to then create that film. You go, well, okay, but $300 million, that's still more than $200 million, so you're still an idiot and I'm still unsubbing. Hang on. When you release a movie in the United States, when you see it in a theater, the theater keeps about 45% of the gross. What that means is you look at that budget there, you see, or I'm sorry, you look at that gross that says $300 million, minimum, you cut that in half because about half of that money went to theater chains instead of to the company. And that's just in the US. I think Canada also does it about 50% the way the US does, but certain European countries do more like the 60% split. The Chinese are the worst. When you put a movie in China, the Chinese theaters keep about 75% of the gross, yet they still do it because that 25% over there is fucking huge. Point is, when you look at a movie that says it cost $100 million, but it produced $300 million, it probably made more like $100 million. It actually probably didn't do anywhere near as well as it's saying. And so that ends up being a loss. So for a movie to break even, it actually has to make way more than the stated budget. $100 million movie has to make more like $600 million to break even. So a movie like Justice League that we believe now after multiple reshoots and all that stuff that went into it, had to have produced, you know, with a suggested $300 million budget, had to make about $1 billion to break even. And then it had to exceed that to start making money. Now, for a movie that hasn't even broken the 600 million mark, and now analysts think it probably won't even reach 700 million all said and done, that's a disaster. That is a disaster. So you go, all right, well, what's the future? What's next with Justice League? Probably nothing. Aquaman will still be made because it was already shot. It was already in the can, so that's going to be released. And I'll bet you Wonder Woman 2 still happens because Wonder Woman was the only movie in the DCU that got really positive reception and actually made a bunch of money. So they'll probably do a second one of those. And then after that, I think you're going to kind of see that brand kind of die off. And it's really a shame because I love a lot of those characters, especially Superman. And I've always wanted to see, I want to see another Superman movie. But the universe we have is not the place for that. Not the Zack Snyder universe is a terrible, terrible cinematic universe, and it shouldn't have been made. Like I said, it really shouldn't have happened to be on Man of Steel. Like, he should have stepped away. They should not have allowed him anywhere near the cameras. But they did, and Batman v Superman has kind of made it unfixable. Unless they had turned Justice League into an X-Men Days of Future Past type of story where it just goes in and deletes the previous movies that weren't good, there's not much you can do about it. And I don't think they're going to be able to fix it. It's unfortunate because the model they wanted to create was like what happened with Thor Ragnarok. Now, Thor Ragnarok was a good movie, but it wasn't an amazing film. It was just good. Yet everyone went out to see it, and it made a fuck ton of money because everyone's hooked into the MCU now. Because every movie that comes out, everybody understands is some sort of tied to a universe they already like. It's probably going to be pretty good. And, you know, it's just the next episode of a big ongoing show that's been going for years. So people want to see that stuff. But nobody gives a fuck about the DCU, except for, like, you know, super fanboys. And I would like to consider myself one, except I don't actually consider myself a fanboy of anything because that word has an actual meaning that idiots on the internet don't understand. But I love Superman, and so to see him cursed in this universe that doesn't work is frustrating. And you recognize it when you watch Justice League that they kind of figured out that the Superman that showed up, especially in Batman v Superman, is not the real Superman. It's just like some a terrible Zack Snyder version. There's a lot of nods to him in Justice League saying, hey, you know, we're going to kind of fix you. We're going to make you better for the future, if there is a future, which I kind of doubt there is, which is too bad. I mean, like, there's so much messed up about that movie. Like, a lot of people bring up Henry Cavill's face. He's Superman. I remember watching it in theaters, and the opening shot of the film is him like being filmed by some kids, and he's just talking to them. And I looked at him, and I'm like, something's wrong here, but I couldn't quite figure it out. It was the uncanny valley thing. And I figured that out after everybody said, like, you know, he had his beard CGI'd off. I'm like, I didn't know he did, but that explains it now, because his face looked fucking weird, and I couldn't figure out what it was. And if you're not familiar, you know, he had a beard when they did the reshoots because he was doing Mission Impossible 6. And he wanted to shave it, but Tom Cruise specifically would not allow it. He said, you need a real beard for this movie or you're not on the movie. So the only alternative was to CGI a no beard onto him for the reshoots. That's Hollywood. It's fucking weird. But yeah, so that movie, I mean, hindsight's 2020, of course, but Justice League really should have been pushed back. They really should have reassessed what their plans were. And I think, I mean, it depends on your launching point. If you're going to talk about like where that universe should have started, they should have done a better job out of the gate instead of Man of Steel, even though I liked Man of Steel. If Man of Steel is your starting point, you should not have done Batman v Superman at all. You should have been doing individual character pictures that each tie themselves together by using the Man of Steel event, like I said. And if Batman v Superman still exists, then your Justice League should have been a story that undoes the events of that. But now I think that universe is completely broken beyond the 2 films that we'll probably still get, which nobody's really going to care all that much about, because that's the other thing. If you want to talk about it in video game terms, the DCU is a little bit like owning a Wii U like 2 years ago or 3 years ago. You liked it in a lot of ways. There was a lot of things really wrong with it. There's a lot of decisions made by its parent company you just scratch your head about and you're like, why did you do it that way? Why didn't you do this? And you sit there going, it's not dead, but it has no future. The Wii U is very similar to the Justice League in that regard, or the Wii U was very similar to the Justice League in that regard. So I don't know. I know that's not really my thoughts on the movie. If the actual movie, in the end, I enjoyed it fine. Superman was the best part of it. And again, I know I sound biased because he is my favorite character in comic books, but he really is the best part of that movie. And it's unfortunate that we won't really see much else of him. But yes, you know, it's a standard kind of story, which sucks because I know they had something bigger in mind. It was supposed to be 2 movies originally, and then it was compressed down to 1. And ultimately, that kind of leads to a very meh movie. So we'll see. We'll see if they ever do anything else with it, but I'll bet you they don't. But anyway, I guess that's it for this month on the Figure It Out cast. I want to thank all of you guys for listening. Of course, I want to thank the Patreon backers, Corey Marsh, Tim Inman, Trey Wagner, Rob Janos, Justin Webb, Joshua Finzi, as well as Kyle Vaughn. You guys are awesome. And thank you to all the other backers who are at any particular level. You get early access or anything like that. And of course, anybody who's just listening to this just to listen to it, I appreciate that as well. Thank you very much for watching. I'll see you all later.